And so today what we're going to be talking about is the doctrine of Mary, and we're going to be confronting what Roman Catholicism teaches with regards to that. And let me just tell everybody this. uh, Brother Kauffman is really he does a lot of work, and he is very in depth in the material that he presents. Now, I I can sort of give a defense against the doctrine of Mary that's held by the Roman Catholics, but not at the same level as Tim Kaufman. So I have very little to offer to today's message other than to just maybe ask questions and if they come up. But after going through Tim Kaufman's notes last night, he sent them to me. He's very thorough, and I don't know if I have any questions because he just covers the material in such a way that's very helpful. So, Brother Tim, let me just say thank you for coming on. It's a joy to have you here with us today. You've been out. I know that you got sick for a while, and then you've just been busy with work and everything else that's going on. But real quick, is there anything else that you would want to add to what I said? Anything else that you've got going on?
Well, I appreciate the introduction, of course, and I'll do the best I can to convey the information that I have. We'll go over some of it pretty quick, and what I like to do is provide references. But I want to go back to the issue of Hank Hanegraaff. I was so disappointed to hear that he'd converted, and what I typically find is that Eastern Orthodoxy is just a waypoint on people's road to Rome, and he's not the first one to take that path and won't be the last. But what I find is that so many Protestants in their studies of church history start in the 16th century. And so when Roman Catholicism comes with a lot of arguments from the preceding centuries, the Protestants will swallow those arguments whole and authoritative, and swallow them as authoritative arguments, and don't have the resources necessary to counter the arguments. And so what I find is they often are victims of their own ignorance and victims of the fraudulent reconstruction of history that Roman Catholic apologists present as the truth. And I'll just say it as it is. It's a fraudulent reconstruction of history. And when people are not equipped to answer the historical argument, they tend to fail in the scriptural argument as well. And what I mean is that we can be equipped from the scriptures to make arguments, and it's important that we do. But it's a very powerful argument that is made by Roman Catholics when they say, oh, all the early church believed differently from you. Was the whole early church wrong? And then people say, wow, the early church couldn't be wrong. Otherwise, Jesus is a liar, and therefore I need to bow down to the cross and to relics and to the Eucharist and to Mary. And what I want to do, and what I hope we can do here, is just equip our listeners with some information that will help them argue against the Roman Catholic apologist. And just to give you some illustrations, and we'll get into this later on when we cover Mary as Ark of the Covenant.
Well, let me just I just want to point out that you hit the nail on the head. I don't suppose that you heard Hank Hanegraaff's radio show yesterday, did you?
No, I did not.
Because he said exactly what you just went over, that we need to get back to what the early church believed, and he kept referencing the early church and what they viewed, and that's what we need to go back to. And so I think that you're identifying the problem accurately.
Well, I actually cover a survey of all these different topics in an article on my blog called Longing for Nicaea. And the title of the blog comes from the fact that so many Roman Catholic arguments have a continuous line of traceability all the way back to the latter part of the 4th century, but they can't quite get to Nicaea. And so many times they try to get to Nicaea, which is, it's generally a church council that everybody would agree was a legitimate council, although there's some folks that would say it was not legitimate. But I read through the canons of Nicaea and the communications of the synodical letters from the Council of Nicaea, and I just don't see anything that's horrific or heretical. And so, because Protestants generally would accept Nicaea as a legitimate council, Roman Catholicism tries quite earnestly to trace its doctrines at least back to Nicaea, which is 325 AD. And they figure if they can get back that far, then even the Protestants would have to get on board, because the Protestants generally agree that Nicaea was a legitimate council. The problem is they always get stuck at the latter part of the fourth century, and I hear it time and time again. The early church believed that Mary was sinless, so they say, and so the Roman Catholic says, yeah, the early church believed that Mary was sinless. Why? As recently as the latter part of the fourth century, we have this father and that father and the other father saying this, that, and the other, but they can't seem to get back earlier, latter part of the fourth century. And one in particular that I thought was very revealing was that Scott Hahn, who also a former Presbyterian, became Roman Catholic. He wrote the famous book Rome, Sweet Home, and talked about returning to Roman Catholicism. And he said, well, the early church believed that Mary was the Ark of the New Covenant. And he says, why is as early as the third century we have Hippolytus describing Mary as the Ark of the New Covenant. Well, when you go back and read Hippolytus, he actually says that Jesus' body was the Ark of the New Covenant, not Mary. And Scott Hahn's reading was based on a misunderstanding of what Hippolytus had said in another paragraph. And what we find throughout the early church, even past the fourth century, is a continuous reference to Jesus as the Ark of the New Covenant, the church is the Ark of the New Covenant, the believer is the Ark of the New Covenant. And you don't end up with Mary as the Ark of the New Covenant really till some obscure reference that was found among the works of Ambrose in the latter part of the fourth century, identifying Mary as the Ark of the New Covenant. And the same thing goes with the Assumption of Mary. There's just no evidence for it in the early church until after the fourth century. Sinlessness traces to the latter part of the fourth century. And we find that over and over again. And so what I want to point out is that we need to know this history, and it's extremely important for us to first state that the scriptures are the sole rule of faith. The important thing for us to understand is that the historical argument that Roman Catholicism makes is fraudulent and is full of gaps. And when Protestants are illiterate in the realm of church history, they tend to fall for those fraudulent arguments, just like Scott Hahn did, just like Jason Stellman did, just like Hank Hanegraaff did. It just happens over and over and over again. And what I want to do is walk through some various aspects, and we're just limiting our discussion to Mary this time, although we've had conversations about the sacrifice of the Mass and its origins in the latter part of the fourth century. And what we'll do is we go through some of these topics on Mary, find that either the doctrines developed late, like 300 years later than the apostolic era, or the references that occurred earlier than that aren't consistent with the modern Roman Catholic interpretation of the terms. And again, I want to equip our listeners so that they don't have to go to the Bible answer man who's going to then convert to Roman Catholicism. They should be able to look these things up on their own, and I think that we can help them do that.